between Moses and Jesus. So those laws were given only to Jewish people for about 15 centuries. They were never intended to be given to anyone other than Jews. St. Paul says, and they were intended to expire at the coming of Jesus. So, if you were a Gentile, as most people in here are, if you were a Gentile in Moses' day, those laws didn't apply to you. Therefore, to be simultaneously a Gentile and a Christian of the post-Jesus era triply negates the application of those laws. But people don't like to admit that, because tucked away in those other 613 commandments are the obscure ones that folks like to pull up. Probably the favorite of which is, the man shall not lie with another man as he lies with a woman. Well, if you're going to enforce that, then to be consistent, you've got to say, and you can't let two kinds of cattle graze together. You can't let two kinds of seeds grow in the same patch. You can't let two kinds of fibers be interwoven into one garment. And another 608 or 9 commandments that I haven't mentioned. It's a preposterous, silly, and self-serving hermeneutic. Now, in the 11 o'clock presentation, someone asked a question that comes at this in a slightly different way, and that is, how do we then, if we're taking Jesus seriously and we've got this whole new ethic, how do we deal with those Old Testament or Hebrew passages? And there are two hermeneutics. Hermeneutics means principles of interpretations. There are two clusters. One is to say, well, we simply dismiss everything other than the ones that Jesus restated. Or we keep everything except the ones he said aren't that way anymore. In either case, you are then left with a Jesus who firmly rejects the death penalty. Woman in adultery, he interrupts the death penalty proceeding. Jesus is unquestionably anti-death penalty. He never favors it. In fact, the only death penalty that he allows is the one to take place on himself because of his sacrificial giving. But he clearly is opposed to the death penalty, and he never speaks against homosexuality. And this has bothered so many people that I've seen them contrive the text and say, yes, Jesus did speak against homosexuality once. And I'm quickly reading their journal articles, and they say, he did remind us that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Well, yes, he reminds us about a whole bunch of things that happened historically. But he neither endorses what happened then, nor that it should happen again, nor that it should happen because of why some people think it happened. Well, the hermeneutical shift, in my view, is to treat the Hebrew Bible material as pertaining to the Jews under the Mosaic covenant, which lasted for about 14 centuries between Moses and the time of Jesus. But it did not apply to people before then. It did not apply to non-Jews during that time. And it does not apply to either Jewish or Gentile Christians thereafter. It's a very odd... If you are going to enforce that hermeneutic, then you can't have Christian people eating pork and catfish. And that's all we know in Mississippi is barbecued pork and catfish. And then grits for breakfast and turnip greens, those are your 4 basic features. Wash them down with sweet tea, take a shot of insulin, and hope God doesn't call you home to glory that night, or whatever. But there's a whole series of bizarre things in there. The man cannot sleep with his wife during the menstrual cycle. Now, surely nobody enforces such a rule today, and there are very absurd and unusual, bizarre things like this that probably did make sense at some point. But whether they make sense or not today, to me, is just irrelevant. In this sense, Dr. Merriam, I'm rather apathetic. I really don't care who sleeps on the couch on which nights. I don't care whether someone grows 2 different kinds of watermelons in the same patch. Or, in fact, we know that hybrids are often better now. That's growing 2 in the same plant. So I'm really not concerned by this, and I'm amazed at people that fixate on these kind of things in the name of religion. Then they quickly retreat to the cliche, which I'm sure you've heard. Well, we don't hate those people. We hate the sin, but we love the sinner. And the truth of those is neither. They never love the sinner. They condemn him and they give all, or her, and they give all kinds of terms, whore, tramp, pervert, whatever. And they really fixate on the sin because that's what they're interested in hearing all about. I lived through the early 80s. I was a pastor in 1980, if you can imagine. That's 31 years ago. I lived through the era when youth pastors then were people who gave a 40-minute sermon. 38 minutes was about their life in drugs and what they used to call hard rock music. And then there was a 2-minute little blurb about Jesus at the end. And you couldn't be a youth pastor if you hadn't done witchcraft or you hadn't... Well, it's just an absurd thing. And they found out that it didn't work because everybody got so interested in the first 38 minutes they failed to listen to the last two. Then, of course, in the 80s you had the scandals of Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, both of whom were Assemblies of God ministers. And in both cases I was doing a master's degree at the Assemblies of God Seminary, which was located in the headquarters building itself. It's a very hilarious time to be working on a divinity degree. Hilarious maybe isn't the word. But one of our Greek professors was a very gracious guy, and he had a great retort. Someone said to him, his name was Gary Little, and someone said to Gary Little, said, Dr. Little, in a great theistic way, the guy said, why does God use all these sinful people? And Little said, well, what other kind does he have? Found it was rather interesting from our Greek professor. Other questions, hell, religion, Mississippi, any other, Jesus, any ethics questions, philosophy? Yes, sir. Very well.
It might be a mouthful.
Okay.
Talking about the rich person, that he gave the parable of the rich guy that was passing by the poor dude, and he said that you should give all your money to him because, and then you'll be saved. Paraphrasing. And the point getting from that is that Jesus is saying that to be rich is almost as equal to be sinful, because it's selfish. It's as much as this day and age they all say how loosely the Bible can be translated. At the same time, if I understand correctly, that a lot of people would argue that a lot of things that was said by him was in context of the time that he was in. Such as the rich person, a lot of people that were rich at that time was not people who earned it, but those who had old money or inherited it. Therefore, where this poor person probably was poor because he inherited poor. Now, if you put that in context of today, if we go by and we work for our money and then a poor person asks for it, more likely or not, we would assume that they would use it for what, meth or prostitution or whatnot, and it would be a perversion of our money that we've earned. So almost could see that it would be taken out of context because of the time change of 2,000 years. Also on top of that is the woman who, it's like Mary Magdalene it might have been, or one of the Marys that was going to be stoned, and he stepped in and said, maybe sinner or person
Her
that
name is
sinned.
never given.
Yeah, but it's always assumed to be Mary, I guess. Is what
It's
it is.
probably not, actually.
It's probably not.
That's the
But
passage we know.
regardless, a woman, and the thought is that he is pro-woman's rights, which is in contrary to that time period because it's a patriarchal society that he's living in. Is that what you're saying?
Well, he certainly goes beyond the patriarchal dominant view of his day.
But right, that's kind of what you were getting at, is that it's a gender reversal in that it's a primarily male society, whereas he's saying we should be paying attention to the women a little more.
He does, and the idea of making Jesus the only person to, say, give women, he gives women a greater prompt. Women would do better under Jesus than they would under Aristotle or Kant, in most cases. Certainly than they would under Aristotle and Plato, who were actually older than Jesus. But I'd like to get back to the wealth thing for a minute, because that's an interesting one. Half of what you say is more than half of what you say is important, but half of it relates to this point. In those days, who owned the land is who was boss. So there's this translation that most people have heard where Jesus says, blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. However, it's not the word world, cosmos in Greek. It's ge, G-E, galpha, eta in Greek, from where we get geography. and it can mean earth, but it's the equivalent of the Hebrew aretz, which usually means land. So Jesus foresees a day when those who don't own the land will get the land. Now, as far as honest livings being earned, there's a great parable, again in Luke chapter 12, of a man who has agricultural land. He cultivates it very well, and he's very successful. He's the man who tears down his barns, build bigger barns to hold all of his great resources. And then he says, and now I'll take it easy and say, eat, drink, and be merry, soul. Yeah, and Jesus in the parable says that God wakes him up in the middle of the night and says, you fool, tonight you have to die. Now who gets these things? So even in the case of a man who is rewarded for his having earned things, there's still the impetus of giving them away rather than retaining them. I would say it's all the more so in the case of things that were handed to people. We, as Americans, have a very difficult time understanding this. Frankie was in the class. No, yeah, you were in that class, I think, the other day. No, you were in the ethics class. I'm sorry. The other day I was teaching this in ethics. We're so used to most people being middle class. I asked people, well, how many of you are middle class? And almost every student's hand goes up. And there's a guy I love, I've had him for several classes, Jerry Wheeler, one or two who know Jerry from southeastern Illinois. And I said, how many are low class? And Jerry's hand just went right up. And mine went up. I'm low class. They say, you know, if you make $190,000 a year, you're middle class. Then I'm very low class. I mean, I can't. My Uncle John believed that man never did land on the moon. That the whole world had conspired to fool us about this. There was no one in my family who ever completed high school, much less college. My parents never finished high school. My grandmother, my mother's mother went to 4th grade. My father's mother never attended school a day in her life, not even kindergarten or 1st grade. So we're used to most people being, we think of ourselves as middle class. That was not the case in the world in which Jesus lived, where you had a handful of people who were very wealthy, and you had the masses who were not at all wealthy, who were very ordinary. And it's an interesting observation in both Mark's gospel and John's gospel. The religious leaders, when they're faced with asking the question, why is Jesus so popular? They say in various forms in Mark and in John, because these ignorant, low-class people are taken in by him. But the rulers and the Sadducees and Pharisees don't buy this kind of religion. It's certainly a class distinction there. There's a very fine, he's now retired, but there was fine work done by Wayne Meeks, who wrote a book called The Social World of Early Christianity. He was both a New Testament scholar and a sociologist of religion from Yale. He does a lot of insight on this. So does John Elliott from San Francisco. There's a number of people that have done a good work on this. Other questions? Yes?
I was still on with that is, where I was going was that with those two things, that you've got an issue of that time that you have a greedy bunch and a poor bunch.
Yeah. Which of course we still have today.
We still have today, but you know, in that time period, he was, you know, some would argue that he was talking to an issue with greedy rich, and at that time he was also dealing with a society that did not recognize women at all. And with that, he was able to use an example of dealing with the woman issue and having a parable as an extreme example of how to deal with the time period that has that problem. Which today is just like how a lot would argue that our Constitution would be kind of old, being 200 years old, that it's out of context now. But some would argue that just as the same 2,000-year-old writing may be out of context, but can still be used as a general guideline of what to live by.
That's what good hermeneutics does when dealing with any ancient or very ancient text, is to extract the principles of interpretation, whether you're dealing with the Constitution, you're a legal scholar, or whether you're a classical scholar and your expertise is Plato, or whether you're dealing with religious texts. Or a good hermeneutic is one that can extract the timeless principles and convey them. But I don't find explicit in Jesus much, if any, more concern against the self-earned rich